that have just joined us, thank you for being here today. My name is Ruth Atherley, and I'm the Communications Director for the Cullen Commission. I want to run through the process quickly so everybody knows what we're doing today. Commissioner Cullen will make his remarks shortly. Once the Commissioner has made his remarks, we'll move to the Q&A. Accompanying Commissioner Cullen, we have Senior Commission Counsel Brock Martland, who's on the phone from Toronto. Here in Vancouver, we have Senior Commission Counsel Patrick McCowan. And I have a double-sided page. It's important to note that the Cullen Commission is independent of government. And as I mentioned earlier in the lockup, I want to acknowledge the technical and logistical events and media relations support provided by the province in Vancouver and Victoria for this session with Commissioner Cullen. When we move into the Q&A with Commissioner Cullen, those of you on the phone, please press *1 to enter the queue. And if you're in the room, please approach the mic. We want to get as many questions as possible in today, so we're limiting it to one question and one follow-up. Now, I'm going to leave it to Commissioner Cullen to make his opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Is this on? Can you hear me all right? Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Since being announced in May of 2019, the Commission team has held 5 community meetings around the province, undertaken thousands of hours of investigation, research, and interviews, held 143 hearing sessions over 138 hearing days, heard testimony from 199 witnesses, with an additional 23 witnesses providing evidence via sworn affidavit, and received 1,063 exhibits. In December of 2020, I released my interim report. As with most public inquiries, the Commission was established in the wake of significant public concern about its subject matter, in this case, the nature and extent of money laundering in British Columbia. The issue was initially brought to the forefront by a watchful press, which was aided in its efforts by individuals whose occupations confronted them with evidence of widespread money laundering in certain sectors of the economy. For the past 3 years, I've served as the commissioner for this public inquiry that was mandated to look into this challenging problem of money laundering in British Columbia. Our mandate included a sector-by-sector analysis of the growth, evolution, and methods of money laundering, the acts or omissions of those responsible to regulate those sectors that contributed to money laundering, the effectiveness of the anti-money laundering efforts of the regulators, and the barriers that have inhibited effective law enforcement. My final report is now being released to the public. I hope that today will mark a turning point for the way that governments deal with money laundering in this province. Money laundering is fundamentally destabilizing to the society and the economy that we all want for the province. It allows criminals and bad actors to exploit the very things that we value: stability, sound financial and professional institutions, and personal privacy. Sophisticated money launderers have used British Columbia as a clearinghouse or a terminus for laundering an astounding amount of dirty money. Even though we cannot accurately put a dollar figure on the volume of money laundering that takes place, I conclude in my report that it is a vast amount. While much of this activity has occurred covertly in the shadows, some has happened in plain sight. In the lead up to this commission, concern was raised in the public discourse about the lack of response to what appeared on its face to be highly suspicious funds being used and laundered in this province. Those suspicions were correct, and it was right to be alarmed by this activity and the lack of meaningful response to it. For too long, money laundering has been kept on the sidelines for police, for law enforcement, for regulators, and for governments. Money laundering activity has been and remains to be poorly understood, even by some of the public bodies that need to address it. And money laundering has rarely been given priority. Too often, it has been largely ignored. It's time for that to change. My report puts forward 101 recommendations directed primarily to the provincial government and provincial agencies. Those recommendations range from broad, overarching changes to quite specific reforms required of particular agencies. The recommendations, if implemented, will begin to address, in a serious way, a problem that has grown through decades of inaction and ineffectiveness. The report is more than 1,800 pages long. It sets out my findings of fact after lengthy public hearings and my analysis of complex policy issues and practical questions. I have tried to make recommendations that are based on the best possible standards and that are supported by rigorous analysis, but that are also rooted in real-world practicality. Government, law enforcement, and regulators will need to be focused and committed to change if we are to see a serious and effective response to money laundering. The report is long, but the executive summary is a far more accessible document at just over 30 pages. Following the executive summary, I have set out in one place all of the 101 recommendations which I make. I'm not going to stand here or sit here and spend hours reviewing all the recommendations and key findings. They've been made public. They speak for themselves, but I do want to highlight a few key items. First of all, I recommended the creation of an entirely new office to deal with money laundering. This will be an office of the legislature with a status that will permit independence from the government of the day. I refer to the head of this office as the Anti-Money Laundering Commissioner. This is a different kind of commissioner than I have been and is more analogous to the Human Rights Commissioner, in terms of form, of course, not function. The AML Commissioner will provide permanent strategic oversight of how the province responds to money laundering. The Commissioner will be focused exclusively on money laundering and will provide advice and recommendations to government, law enforcement, and regulatory bodies on money laundering issues. The office will monitor, review, audit, and report on the performance of provincial entities with a money laundering mandate. It will lead working groups and cooperative efforts to address money laundering issues. I want to be clear here, the AML Commissioner's role would be distinct and different than the role I have had as Commissioner of this inquiry, and I am not the person who will fill it should government decide to undertake this recommendation. I also recommend the creation of a new dedicated provincial intelligence and investigation unit, a new policing unit that will lead the law enforcement response to proceeds of crime and money laundering in this province. It will identify, investigate, and disrupt sophisticated money laundering, and it will train and support other investigators and police agencies in their investigations of money laundering and proceeds of crime cases. The kind of unit I recommend will be a high-end and specialized unit, one that has significant expertise and that is structured quite differently than traditional police units. It will be akin to, but not precisely the same as, the IPOC unit that formed part of the RCMP until 2012. The costs of this new unit should be offset by a renewed focus on targeting illicit assets for forfeiture. Assets seized by law enforcement bodies in this jurisdiction have been relatively anemic. We've seen a high of $19.6 million in 2010-2011 to a low of $2.9 million in 2018-2019. These amounts are simply not commensurate with the amounts which are laundered annually in British Columbia, nor with the amounts seized in comparable jurisdictions. New Zealand, for example, has a similar population and GDP to British Columbia, but has achieved much greater success at identifying and seizing or restraining illicit funds. In New Zealand's case, in a comparable, not precisely the same, but comparable period of time, they seized $358 million in Canadian funds, of which 56% was said to be money laundering. I have accordingly made a number of recommendations respecting criminal and civil asset forfeiture, including in the civil asset forfeiture realm that the province proceed with its plan, which predated the establishment of this commission, to implement an unexplained wealth order regime. In many specific areas, I have made recommendations for regulators, public bodies, and government. In these brief remarks, I have identified only a few of the recommendations which I have made to abate the money laundering problem in British Columbia. And I've already noted that my report includes 101 recommendations that are designed to address the manifold aspects of this area of criminal profiteering. I am hopeful that armed with the available tools, the provincial government can successfully take on those who would attempt to corrupt the institutions which British Columbians rely on to serve a coherent and fair social order. As I conclude what has proven to be a challenging but important task, I want to extend my thanks to the participants in the Commission of Inquiry, and particularly to my team, who have worked so hard to complete the lengthy hearings during a pandemic. I also want to thank the people of this province who have been concerned and supported our work. We've done our work in order to serve the public interest. The Commission was created by the provincial government, but it is entirely independent of the provincial government. We've gone about our work independently, and I'm happy to report that the province has consistently respected our independence. This report represents my thinking, not the provincial government's, nor the federal government's, nor anyone else's. It is my analysis and the analysis of my team of first-class lawyers and my recommendations for reform. My aim is to offer advice that is realistic, practical, and effective. There are reasons for optimism, because a new prioritization and support for anti-money laundering will mean that our province can make headway in combating this social ill. Thank you all for being here. We have half an hour for questions, and they will be moderated. I look forward to attempting to answer your questions and providing additional context and information regarding my report in answer to those questions.
Thank you very much. To media in the room, if you have a question, please come and queue behind me at the microphone. And media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue for the opportunity to ask a question and a follow-up. Our first question today is going to come from John Waugh, Global News. John, please go ahead.
Hello, Commissioner. The word unwittingly was once used to describe how casinos were turned into laundromats for dirty money. After this extensive process, how unwitting do you think it was on behalf of government, governing bodies, casinos, and law enforcement?
I think that's a very good question. I think the information was there to draw, sorry, the information was there to draw different conclusions about what was transpiring within the casinos. But as I said in my report, I think there was a failure of will to deal with it. And I don't think that equates to deliberate or witting failure to deal with it, but I do think it does represent a failure of will.
In regards to regulators, there was some failures identified with GPAB, law enforcement, but particularly BCLC. And we heard evidence during the commission that there was almost this theme of a counter-narrative. And you seem to really hit that hard in your report. Was there a reason that it seems that BCLC bared most of the brunt when it came to overseeing governing bodies on the responsibility here?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the last part of your question.
Yeah, so out of the three, GPAB, law enforcement, and BCLC, you spent the most time, especially in your executive summary, talking about how BCLC had a lot of information, but really did not act on that information. And in evidence, we heard that there was also often, within their own newsletters and discourse that was made available, there was almost a counter-narrative of where that money was coming from and why or why not it was not suspicious.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that's an accurate characterization of the evidence. If you're asking why that was the case, again, I return to the theme I expressed earlier. I think there was a lack of will that underlay BCLC's approach to the question, and it was difficult for BCLC to deal with some of the issues they had, but there could have been more that was done at that time to deal with those issues, in my view.
And for the purposes of sightlines, we've changed the microphone to the back of the room here. So we have Renee Filippone, CBC, is next.
Thank you.
Obviously, this report takes a look back at money laundering for a significant period of time. When we talk about money laundering right now, what do we know about who is doing this, domestic, international? Are we still looking at money from China? And what are the primary ways this is being done? Is it still casinos? Is it more primarily real estate? When we're trying to understand, if someone needs to be tackling this, where should they be looking?
Yeah. Well, I think that is the reason why I've recommended the AML commissioner, because that person will occupy the position of someone who keeps a careful eye on what's going on in the world of money laundering in the province, and be in a position to identify different areas that come up. Peter German, in his report, referred to money laundering as being akin to whack-a-mole, and I think that's an apt description. It pops up where you least expect it, and it's always important to be looking at different organizations, different ways of doing it. Trade-based money laundering is a good example. That appears to be a very fruitful source of money laundering for some criminal organizations.
Yeah, one of the things that Commissioner Cullen discusses in the report is the extent to which criminal organizations and professional money launderers are opportunistic and adaptable. And they look for opportunities, they look for weaknesses, and attempt to exploit them. We saw that in the context of casinos in this province. And it's going to be important for the AML Commissioner and enforcement agencies and governments to be alive to the shifting and opportunistic nature of money laundering if they're going to have success in combating it.
The report obviously takes a look at the role FinTrack does or doesn't play in helping these sorts of investigations. How ineffective, in your mind, has FinTrack been in the ability, in giving the ability for provincial authorities to tackle this?
Well, one of the reasons that we've recommended a a provincial intelligence gathering and an investigative unit is due to the fact that FINTRAC doesn't appear to be effective in getting information back to the province's law enforcement units. The FINTRAC gets something in the order of magnitude of 30 million reports a year, but gives out 25, something in the order of magnitude of 2,500 reports back to law enforcement, about 350 of which come to British Columbia. So what we're suggesting is there is a need for much more mobile and malleable enforcement process where intelligence can work with enforcement. So that's why we've recommended that.
Our next question from the room comes from Jeremy Nuttall, The Star.
Thank you.
Hi, you were fairly, you put a lot of blame, I guess, on two federal agencies, that being RCMP and FINTRAC. I'm curious if you can tell me if that lack of will, which you spoke of, also applied to these federal agencies?
I'm really constrained in what I can say about federal agencies in my report. And I've tried to ensure that I don't trench on federal jurisdiction because I am a provincially appointed commissioner. But I have looked at the federal response to money laundering in British Columbia in order to identify some of the gaps in order to make recommendations as to what I think are necessary to fill those gaps. So I don't want to get too much into parsing the responses of federal agencies. I think I have to be very cautious about that.
Did you characterize how cooperative they were in this inquiry?
Oh, they were very cooperative.
Next question, Kim Boland, Vancouver Sun.
Hi, thanks. I have a couple of questions. One is quite specific. You talk about this new investigative and intelligence unit under CFSEU. Would there be embedded prosecutors in this unit? Because one thing I didn't see in my quick, peruse of the executive summary was the fact that we've had a lot of organized crime, money laundering cases where charges have been recommended, sometimes late and then later stayed, which is, of course, a decision of Crown prosecutors. And where would the officers come from for this unit? We have staffing shortages in policing across the province of up to 30% in some jurisdictions, right? So there's generally a staffing shortage among policing agencies in BC. And my second question is very specifically, you talk about expansion of the role of the Civil Forfeiture Office, but like 2 years ago, we had the BC Supreme Court rule the BC Civil Forfeiture Act as unconstitutional. So while there is an appeal underway of that ruling from 2 years ago, in the meantime, does it make sense to expand the powers of something that's been ruled unconstitutional?
Well, with respect to the civil forfeiture question, I'm not in a position to speak in detail about the ruling, although I do have some familiarity with it. It does not address the regime as a whole, but only a specific aspect of it. And the recommendations that Commissioner Cullen is making about an expanded operational capacity and a broader reaching focus will continue to apply regardless of the outcome of that proceeding once it ultimately runs its course. There is Commissioner Cullen identifies a real opportunity for an expanded focus on the part of the Civil Forfeiture Office, which should have a couple of benefits. One is meaningfully impacting on organized crime and disrupting them in a way that hits where it really hurts, their finances. And the other is that there will be a trickle-down financial benefit to the province, the contribution to provincial revenue from assets that are forfeit through that expanded focus. You asked some questions about the nature of the Intelligence and Investigation Unit, and you're right, it didn't all make its way into the executive summary. But one of the reasons the Commissioner recommends the structure that he does is so that the province has control over hiring, staffing, and the ability to ensure the funding is dedicated to that unit and those positions are filled. And I think there's a hope that there will be a focus on hiring individuals with expertise and a true interest in having an enduring commitment to combating this type of crime, and that those individuals will be used to staff and support this unit as it gets underway and goes about doing its work.
Yeah. And so far as the prosecutors are concerned, I think what we're recommending is that there be a team of prosecutors that are available to give ongoing advice to the police as they work through their investigations, and be in a position to conduct charge approval when the report is finished.
Okay, thanks.
Our next question comes from Frank Chi, Omni.
Commissioner, I noticed that in the report you mentioned about China, especially in the casino transaction, but there is no recommendation on international cooperation in curbing money laundering, especially with law enforcement in China. I guess it's maybe political, legal, or policing system difference, especially concerning the code relation between the two countries now. So could you elaborate more on why there is no recommendation on international cooperation about money laundering? Because if that's a big factor.
Yes, I think you raise a very good point. Basically, the answer is simply that that's a matter that falls within the purview of the federal government, and it falls outside of my jurisdiction to be able to make recommendations to the federal government about what they should or shouldn't do vis-a-vis liaising or engaging in a joint enterprise with another government.
The Commissioner does, throughout the report, though, speak to the importance of coordination and cooperation as between governments.
And a follow-up question about the housing affordability and money laundering issue. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Because when Minister Eby, when he was not the minister yet, he is alleging that the money laundering, especially within the Chinese community, Chinese-Canadian community, is a big factor in driving up property price in Vancouver. So how do you come to the conclusion that there is no illicit, say, link between property price and the money laundering?
Well, my conclusion is a little more nuanced than that. But my view, after hearing the evidence, particularly from members of CMHC, is that the causes of the housing unaffordability in the Lower Mainland primarily relates to low interest rates, high demand, and low supply, and that's really the driver, in my view, of high prices in the Lower Mainland. I think if the provincial government were to implement the recommendations which I've made, they ought not to expect that the issue and the very problematic issue of housing unaffordability in the Lower Mainland will be solved by that.
Our next question comes from Martin McMahon, City News 1130.
Hi, Commissioner. Just a question. Your report touches on the BC Liberal government and some of the actions that it took when it learned about some of these money laundering issues. Based on what you've looked at throughout this whole process, given the information that those ministers had, did the government take reasonable steps at that time, given what those officials knew?
I think the government took reasonable steps, but not sufficient steps. That may seem a bit contrary to put it that way, but they definitely did take steps. But the steps weren't up to the task of abating money laundering in casinos, which was the major problem at that time.
And I think in the report, the word failures is used rather in relation to some of the decisions or the decisions that were not made. What was the biggest failure from the government of the day?
Well, I want to just be clear. The report discusses the actions of certain individuals, and it's sometimes convenient to use the term government to apply to those actions. But in the report, the Commissioner's discussion is focused on the actions of individuals who held key positions at critical times. And one of the key failings that he identifies is the failure of certain individuals to ensure that suspicious funds that were being received weren't contributing to the provincial revenue stream.
We have one more question in the room before we go to the phones. We hear from Sam Cooper, Global National.
Thanks. Sort of following on that, Commissioner Cullen, you spent some time on the IPOC investigation and Barry Baxter's involvement in it, and we know from federal evidence that the unit said that certain casinos were using foreign nationals as willing pawns in significant money laundering. So that's a pretty high-level assertion. Now we have Mr. Baxter going public with some more guarded comments, Mr. Coleman reacting to him, and you have found, well, Mr. Coleman essentially rebuking him, I think, fair. So you said, Coleman's comments, quote, posed a real risk of misleading the public into believing there was no basis for concern about suspicious transactions in the province casinos at a time when Mr. Coleman had good reason to believe that there was cause to be worried. So my question is that not an indication of comments that could have the effect of impeding the will or the direction of the RCMP to look into money laundering in BC, indeed possibly Canada? Well,
yes. I mean, I think that's why I identified those comments and made my findings in relation to them.
Okay, we're going to go to the phone lines next. From Victoria, we'll hear from Rob Shaw, Check News. Rob, please go ahead.
Hi, Commissioner. Could you re-summarize for us why you did not find any corruption on the part of officials involved in this, specifically the politicians?
Yeah, I can, Rob, thanks for the question. I can sort of point you to some of the Commissioner's findings in that regard. He's concluded that, well, some officials could have done more, and in some cases should have done more. None of those failures were motivated by the hope of personal, financial, political, or some other type of gain. So in short, there were failings, but they were not motivated by a corrupt purpose.
Rob, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. Back to the Commissioner again. There is a section here on former Premier Christy Clark and a conclusion that her response, kind of overseeing the government and prioritizing its actions, was inadequate, and she shares at least some of the blame for the continuation of money laundering in casinos. Could you expand on that and her role as Premier being particularly important and why you came to those conclusions?
I don't think I can expand on that. I think I have to let the report speak for itself.
Our next question, also from Victoria, is from Dirk Meissner, Canadian Press. Dirk, please go ahead.
Hi, Commissioner. I also wanted to focus a bit on the politicians. In the testimony of former ministers Coleman, Bond, and de Jong, and the former Premier Christy Clark, they all testified that they knew some sort of suspicious activity was happening at casinos, but they all sort of were saying, well, there's no smoking gun, so we're just, we'll try something, but we'll let things go, as we'll try to make some help it out or fight it somehow, but we'll just it's going to keep going. I'm just wondering what you feel about all their responses and their actions that they took.
Well, I don't think that's all that they did. I mean, I think in the case of Mr. Coleman, for example, he engaged Rob Croker to look into the issue of money laundering in casinos. In the case of Mr. de Jong, he was responsible for setting in motion the pieces to get Jiggit established. So I think there were things that were done by members of that government that were designed to attempt to come to grips with the issue of money laundering in casinos.
Derek, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. Can you also comment on why the RCMP, why you say the RCMP were underplaying money laundering in British Columbia for those years?
Sorry, for what? I missed your last.
For not investigating, not investigating money laundering the way they should have.
I don't know that the Commissioner uses the word underplaying. I think he finds that there was a lack of priority and a lack of resources dedicated to the investigation of and ultimately fight against money laundering by law enforcement in this province for a significant period of time.
All right. We'll come back to the room now. We hear from Jason Proctor, CBC.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned a little while ago there was a failure of will, I think you called it. What, from your experience and from the evidence that you saw, what can you speak a bit more about that, what the origins of that failure of will are, so that, you know, the current governments can learn from that, I suppose?
Well, I don't know that I can. I'm just describing the effect of inaction over a period of time in the face of significant concern about dirty money entering the casino industry. And I don't think I can tell you what the well springs of that are. I can tell you what I observed through the evidence.
I mean, I guess it leads to sort of the question of there's money flowing in, there's, I guess, a certain joy in seeing money go into the coffers. I mean, is that part of what causes a failure of will, I suppose, in terms of how deeply do you want to look into something that's going to ultimately possibly cost you? And how does that fit into the story of money laundering generally?
I think the Commissioner discusses a number of sort of origins of a lack of action that occurred in this province over a number of years. In some respects, it was a lack of understanding. In some respects, it was a lack of resourcing. In some respects, especially on the part of law enforcement, it was a failure, and other agencies, a failure to prioritize. You know, when you speak about the money flowing in and nothing being done about it, I assume you're speaking of the casino industry, and the Commissioner does identify that there were a number of hallmarks that obviously disclosed a substantial amount of those funds to be highly suspicious and in fact illicit in nature.
Our next question comes from the phone lines. We hear from Bob Mackin, Breaker News.
I don't want to interrupt Mr. Mackin, but I don't know if I can be heard. It's Brock Martland, Commission Counsel, and I was going to pick up on an aspect of Jason's question, if I might.
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Brock.
Thank you. So part of the question about failures in my mind, when one then turns to look to the future, and I think the report addresses this, is to say, and the Commissioner in his opening remarks a few moments ago referred to the concept of money laundering being, for a long time, not the focus and not the subject of public and regulatory and law enforcement attention. And one of the things to deal with that problem is one of the signal recommendations in the report is the creation of an anti-money laundering commissioner, and that office would be in a position to ensure, including with public reporting on a regular basis, that there isn't a similar failure of the will, that it's not a topic that is up on the agenda this year but slides down the agenda in 2 or 4 years from now, that there's a consistent and an exclusive focus on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to the phones to hear from Bob Mackin, Breaker News. Bob, please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. A question for Brock Marland and Commissioner Cullen. The Commission wasn't able to hold the federal government accountable, but municipalities are creatures of the provincial government. Why weren't any current or former mayors, councillors, chiefs of staff, bureaucrats from Vancouver and Richmond called to testify? And on the same token, Paul King-Gin's lawyer was a participant, but you didn't call Paul King-Gin to testify. You didn't hear from any real estate developers. Premier Horgan himself, he's a former casino lobbyist. We didn't hear from him. That's a long list of people that weren't heard from. Can you explain your reasoning for not going to those people and calling them to testify?
I'll try, Bob, to take an answer, and I suspect you'll get an upgrade when the Commissioner answers. I think from a Commission Council point of view, as we worked our way collectively to figure out what evidence to lead and where to focus, although it did take a long time to do all of this work and run these hearings and put forward the evidence, on the other hand, I don't think we pretended ever that we'd be perfectly comprehensive, and without taking a decade and costing much, much more, we couldn't be comprehensive. So I think the Commissioner's approach to this was to focus on areas where there are identified risks and concerns, and then to make decisions about where to lead evidence. Where there was evidence pointing to particular periods of time with a higher risk or higher set of concerns, that was generally where we focused our attention, and we did make judgment calls, if you will, in terms of who would be brought in as witnesses and where the attention fell. I don't disagree that there are, you've named a few people, I'm not speaking about them specifically, but no doubt a list of others who people would have wanted to hear from. But the nature of the inquiry is that we're balancing trying to be informed and give the public the benefit of the Commissioner's analysis and recommendations, but also to get the job done and not to let it go adrift and not to take 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Brock, that part of what we were attempting to do was bring the Commission in more or less on time and more or less on budget, and not plunge down. I'm going to use the term rabbit holes. I don't mean these are simply rabbit holes, but plunge down areas that are going to get us caught up in much more activity than we want to. But one of the reasons I've recommended the Anti-Money Laundering Commissioner is really to serve that purpose on an ongoing basis. So that person can look at the very things that you're talking about, Mr. Mackin, including municipal governments and other agencies that are at play in this area.
Bob, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. You didn't really need 10 years. Your commission spent only 3 years. Maybe 4 years would have been more suitable, like the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec, that lasted 4 years. Unlike the Charbonneau Commission, it doesn't appear that you recommended any charges. And I also note that the province regulates securities, but the Commission really didn't go down the road to look at money laundering and fraud in markets. And there's several British Columbians right now who are facing charges in the U.S. for fraud and money laundering. And BC has a long history of fraud and money laundering in stock markets. Why did you shy away from that big money area?
It's fair to say the Commission shied away from anything. The Commission identified areas of most significant concern and opportunity for the province and led evidence on those, and the Commissioner has analyzed those and made recommendations. You refer to a lack of recommendation for the charges, and that is just simply not what a provincial commission is about. Provincial commissioner is not, it would be inappropriate for a provincial commissioner to make findings of civil or criminal liability. His job is to fulfill his mandate, which is to conduct an investigation and analysis of the evidence that is before him with a view to making recommendations to the province to address the problems identified or the issues identified in terms of reference.
Now we'll come back to the room for our final two questions. First of the two is Graham Wood, Glacier Media. Graham, please go ahead.
Hi. We heard about how lottery officials took big bonuses, and we're talking about how there's a failure of will. Can you elaborate on, did you figure out why there was a failure of will?
Well, I think there was a period of ambiguity and uncertainty about what this money was, where it was coming from. And until it crystallized into certainty in the summer of 2015, there was a lack of will to deal with it. I think that's the best answer I can give you there.
So how do you prove corruption other than bags of cash transacting? You know, how do you prove, like, how do you determine what corruption is, and how do you prove it, and how do you come to that determination?
I think in the context of this inquiry, the Commissioner was looking to see, when looking for corruption, whether there was a failure to act or some action that was taken to facilitate money laundering in order to obtain a personal benefit, whether that be financial, political, or otherwise. And through a fairly thorough investigation, while he found failures, he did not find they were motivated by a corrupt purpose.
So talking about how government coffers were, plumped up through this activity, was that not a political gain on the part of the politicians in terms of speaking in relation to the failure of will?
The Commissioner has identified a failure of will that failed to prevent illicit cash from contributing to the province's revenue, but he does not find that any of the inactions or failures were motivated by a corrupt purpose on the part of any of the individuals he discusses.
And our final question today comes from Amelia Macower, CBC Radio-Canada.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I was just wondering regarding the whole corruptions of politicians, especially Mr. Coleman and Mrs. Clark. With everything that Dave said, and you said that there was no indication of a personal gain, so this is why there was no indication of corruption. But how do you, in your report, in your investigation, how did you prove that there was no personal gain there? Like, what evidence did you have to prove that?
The Commissioner was directed in his terms of reference to determine whether any action or inaction was motivated by corruption. As he indicated in his opening comments, the Commission conducted a thorough investigation, thousands of hours of investigation, interviews, examination of extensive documentation, almost 200 days of hearings almost 200 witnesses heard from, over 130 or 40 days of hearings. And throughout all of that, there was no evidence that the Commissioner identified that supported a finding of a corrupt purpose on the part of those officials you've identified.
So is it solely based on hearsay, like testimony, or is there actual factual proof that they didn't have a hand in anything?
It's always difficult to prove a negative, and the Commission is not about proving or disproving anything. It's an inquisitorial process where the job of the Commission, Council, and ultimately the Commissioner is to get at the truth. So there was a thorough inquiry done, and the findings of the Commissioner in that regard are set out in his report.
Just checking, Brock, do you have anything to add before we wrap?
I actually did on that last point, and I know it's hard to interject when I'm by phone. In terms of the questions about corruption, that is the terms of reference for this commission directed the commissioners to examine that question and make findings. We conducted investigations to look precisely for evidence of that nature. The report speaks to that. The executive summary speaks to that and says there was no corruption. And I hear in some of the questions maybe a note of disappointment, but maybe I'm reading into it. But I would have thought it's a good thing that a process like this leads to a conclusion that even after looking for it, there wasn't corruption. But of course, readers will be the judge as they look at the report. And I know it's easy to say read an 1800 report, but there is a lot of detail. There's a lot more than we're able to cover in this sort of a back and forth. And I would encourage people to read through particular sections to have the exact words of the Commissioner.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. That concludes the availability.
15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Going to try counting past 20 now. 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12. Yep, do your thing.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your patience. I understand we had some audio challenges. It's an honor to join you here today on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Thank you for your interest in this important issue for our province. I'd like to begin by thanking Commissioner Cullen and his dedicated team for delivering the final report of the Commission of Inquiry into Money Laundering in British Columbia. The Commission spent years working on this very significant report. They clearly took their work very seriously, hearing from the public, experts, and those involved in anti-money laundering work in the province, nationally, and internationally. Hello? Hello? Okay, great. The Commission spent years working on this very significant report. They clearly took their work very seriously, hearing from the public, experts, and those involved in anti-money laundering work in the province, nationally, and internationally. Their report provides our government and the Government of Canada, along with regulators, law enforcement agencies, and businesses, with a comprehensive, ambitious yet realistic roadmap to continue and coordinate our work fighting money laundering in British Columbia and Canada. Our government asked the Commissioner to look into the problem of money laundering and tell us how big a problem it really is. Was this just a matter of a failed federal prosecution concerning one rogue money laundering business? Had the province functionally eliminated the issue in casinos? Or was this, as I and many suspected, a problem that crossed sectors, had national and international links, and required sustained, multi-year, and multi-pronged responses? The Commissioner's response to this question is authoritative, complete, and disturbing. In this report, the Commissioner has advised all British Columbians and the Government of Canada that the volume of money laundering in our province is, quote, enormous, unquote. On reading this report, it is clear that the Commissioner's overriding conclusion in this regard is well grounded in testimony from police, experts in the field, and direct primary research. This important conclusion and the Commission's connection of money laundering in our province to violent crime and the illicit and poison drug trade underlines the reasons our government called this inquiry and the need for further efforts from all governments, regulators, and businesses. I noted with appreciation the Commission's findings, approving and supporting my own actions when I was responsible for the gambling file. And I'm glad to hear that after extensive review and challenge by various parties that the Commission has confirmed my understanding that there was a serious and decade-long continuing problem of organized crime laundering hundreds of millions of dollars in BC casinos at the time I took over the gaming file. The Commission also confirmed that it was the work of our government in 2017 that revealed the extent of this problem for the public and ended this criminality in relation to casinos after a decade of insufficient action. At this point, I would like to explicitly recognize the important role of members of the media in covering this issue for years before my time in the role as Minister responsible for gaming, and for years after, including during the pendency of this Commission of Inquiry. Many reporters also worked with and were supported by interested citizen advocates who should also be recognized. This number of dedicated reporters, both current and retired, you and I both know who you are, have spent extended amounts of time pulling at the threads that were available on the issue of money laundering, trying to get a sense for the public of the scope of the problem, and trying to ensure accountability and reform without any of the tools the inquiry had to demand records, compel testimony, and investigate. Despite that, you exposed much of what was confirmed by the Commission's work. Without your efforts, I do not believe that this inquiry would have taken place. It was called in response to widespread public concern about this issue, and your work contributed to public education. The conclusions of the Commissioner after years of study are a vindication of you and your work, your motivations for taking it on, and the influence that investigative reporting can have on government priorities and reform. Congratulations for your efforts, and I look forward to you holding me, our government, and those who come after me accountable to these recommendations and this critically important issue for all British Columbians and Canadians. Personally, I will never, ever forget my first briefing by the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch, and I remain grateful to this day for their frank assessment of the problem. I believe it is immoral for government to receive the proceeds of crime in a way that benefits the budget's bottom line and supports that activity. I acted accordingly. I had the support of the Premier and the then Finance Minister in doing so, and I am honored that the Commission agreed with my understandings and concluded that the actions I took, with the support of Dr. Peter German, had the desired outcomes. I thank Dr. German for his work, taken under short timelines with high expectations and scrutiny, for assisting me with grappling with this issue in a way that would result in these positive conclusions from the Commissioner many years later. Our government has continued work on anti-money laundering measures based on previous reports, and much of this work overlaps with the Commission's current recommendations. We have not been waiting for the Commission to conclude. With that noted, I am excited about the potential of these new recommendations to help us attack gang crime, the illicit toxic drug trade, human trafficking, and other evils associated with money laundering in new and aggressive ways, going at the core that motivates, for example, vulnerable young people to consider getting involved in criminal lifestyles, the money, the luxury goods, the cars, and the properties. I'm appreciative of the Government of Canada's participation in this inquiry. I know that some of the findings of the Commission will be challenging for my federal colleagues. They will be, I'm sure, as I am, disappointed by the Commissioner's conclusions about the failures at FinTrack, the ineffectiveness of federal enforcement responses related to money service businesses, the collapse of the federal working group announced in 2018 related to trade-based money laundering, the inadequacy of federal policing dedicated to this issue after literally a decade of public concern about this crime, and on and on and on. There was a reason the federal government wanted to participate in this inquiry with us, as I understood it. Like me, like my colleagues in government, I assume and understand that my federal colleagues saw the collapse of the Federal Prosecution Service's largest anti-money laundering prosecution in Canadian history as the symptom of an underlying serious and ongoing problem. Also, like me and like our government, I believe that they wanted to know what more could be done. Thank you to this commission. We have those answers now. And I hope and expect that the new federal minister with responsibility for this file, Minister Mendicino, will join with us in addressing this important shared challenge. I hope he will have the Prime Minister's and the federal cabinet support in this important cooperative work. With that said, I agree with the Commissioner's implicit, unstated conclusion that the province can no longer rely on or wait for federal responses to address this problem, and we must take on a stronger role related to enforcement around previously exclusively federal responsibilities. For example, the regulation of money service businesses, the requirement of collection of money laundering data from sectors of the economy that should have been on FINTRAC's mandatory reporting list, like the luxury goods sector, and oversight of the export of grey market vehicles. I am enthusiastic about this comprehensive work by the Commissioner and believe these recommendations will help us to transform the meaning of the Vancouver model from a description of unchecked, dirty money moving through our casinos to a model of governments responding forcefully to the threat of money laundering. I look forward to working on these reforms with my colleagues both inside and outside government, with regulators and businesses provincially, with other provinces, with the federal government, and with all British Columbians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for bearing with us through the audio issues today. I would invite any media who have questions here in the room, please come up, line up behind me at the microphone. For anybody on the phone line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. Our first question today is coming from the room. We have Jeremy Nettle, the Star. Jeremy, please go ahead.
Hello, Minister Eby. I'm curious, the idea of setting up a provincial task force to sort of, I guess, pick up the pieces where the federal FINTRAC has failed, does that sort of signify that you've given up on the federal government being able to try to tackle this, or do you think that it's still possible to have FINTRAC strengthened?
I think it's impossible to read this report without coming to two understandings. One is that the support that we hoped for from federal enforcement bodies has not been there in British Columbia. There are many reasons for it, but what we relied on and hoped for was not realized. The second is that even recent announcements from the federal government, for example, in cracking down on trade-based money laundering, have already essentially collapsed. And with those two conclusions, that the measures that we thought were there are not working, the measures that have been announced have not been successfully implemented, it's hard not to reach the conclusion that the Commissioner clearly did, that the province needs to assume responsibilities that previously the federal government would have done. For example, the federal government regulates money service businesses. You need to get a special license from the federal government to operate a money service business. One of the money service businesses that was licensed was one that was under active criminal investigation. It's a finding in the Commissioner's report. Clearly, that system's not working, and so the Commissioner has recommended the province take over the licensing and oversight of money service businesses. So in short, I would say this report confirms our understanding provincially that we need to do more that previously would have been federal government responsibility. And secondly, I hope that, given the federal government's participation in this, this really animates better their response, that they're more enthusiastic, provide more concerted attention to this issue in British Columbia.
When do you imagine you'll be able to start speaking with Minister Mendicino about this?
Because of the restrictions of our Public Inquiry Act, the federal government was only able to receive a copy of this report this morning. The minister and his staff and the federal government will need some time to digest both this very lengthy report and its recommendations. And once they're prepared, I look forward to working with them. Certainly our government does across ministries to address this, and I hope they take up the challenge. Thanks.
Our next question comes from Frank Chi, Omni News.
Thanks.
Minister, when you were still MLA, you released a report pointing fingers at money laundering and specific Chinese Canadian community for driving up property price in Vancouver, and the report did not come to that conclusion. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I disagree with your characterization of my work in opposition as well as the Commission's reports, Frank. A couple pieces. In opposition, I issued a document called Red Flags of Money Laundering in the Real Estate Sector, pointing to specific cases of people using things like bank drafts of sourced from criminal activity to purchase real estate, for example. And these are, despite the fact that that work was done almost a decade ago, many of those red flags that I identified at that time find confirmation in the Commissioner's report around vulnerabilities in the real estate market. I have repeated many, many times that money laundering is not the issue of one community in this province from the very beginning of my work on this issue. And the Commissioner repeats that as well. But the real estate sector, in multiple chapters in this report, is identified as particularly vulnerable. Everything from how developers source their capital, the activities of real estate agents, the activities of accountants and lawyers, all related to the real estate sector. The Commissioner was unable to conclude that money laundering is increasing the pricing of housing in our market right now, but he certainly does not reach the conclusion that it is not an issue.
And the follow-up about there is lack of recognition about international cooperation because it was a federal jurisdiction. So you mentioned about you're going to talk with Minister Mendocino. How are you going to propose on that? Because there were a lot of findings in the report about this is about international organized crime, but there is no recommendation because it's federal jurisdiction.
I'm incredibly grateful for the Commissioner taking on this challenge. And the challenge is an area that has clear areas of federal accountability and responsibility. Yet, we're a province, and the Commissioner was asked to do this by the provincial government. So there were lines, constitutional lines, that the Commissioner was unable to cross. And yet, despite that, the Commissioner was able to provide some very useful findings for the federal government, for the government of BC, as well as some really helpful recommendations about what we can do in BC. And I'll point you to specifically the recommendations of the unexplained wealth orders, where the government of BC, the Commissioner has recommended, could, with judicial oversight, ask people to explain the source of their money when they appear to be connected to criminality or to issues of corruption. And if they are unable to explain it, as they do in other jurisdictions, that property could be seized. This is a very important tool, a remarkable insight in terms of what's possible for us at the provincial level, including a supporting opinion from a former Supreme Court of Canada justice that such activity would in fact be constitutional. So it's recommendations like that. They certainly give me hope that despite the Commissioner saying this is an enormous problem, that we will be able to deploy new ways of going after it.
Our next question from the room is Amelia Macower, CBC Radio-Canada.
Good afternoon, Minister. I was wondering, what was your reaction regarding the portion in the report that says there was no corruption found in the previous government? I'm talking specifically about Prime Minister Christy Clark and Mr. Coleman. It said that there was no corruption because there was no personal gain or found in whatever they did or did not do. So I wanted to have your reaction on that.
Sure. I don't know what the reaction of former legislative members and current legislative members are to the Commissioner's findings, but I'm certainly appreciative of the Commissioner's consideration of my own response to the information I was presented. I'll say frankly that as a politician, I wouldn't be satisfied with a sash awarded by the Commissioner that says not corrupt. I hold myself to a higher standard, and I look forward to seeing what explanations, if any, people who the Commissioner has been critical of at the political level have to provide to British Columbians about why they failed at the job that British Columbians sent them to do.
And so far, is there any recommendations that you think you will be implementing?
Well, I'm very enthusiastic about all of the Commissioner's recommendations. We have some work that has been underway in areas that the Commissioner has also identified. And some of the recommendations actually that the Commissioner has made have already been implemented in reforms we made to the Gaming Control Act in 2018. So I'm very much looking forward to working with my colleagues in finance, public safety on implementation. I think they have the potential to make real difference.
Our next question comes from Graham Wood, Glacier Media.
Hey, David. The report talks about willful failure, but it's hard. I mean, we haven't read everything, but it's difficult to determine what the motive of that was. What do you think the motive was in terms of the bureaucrats and the politicians who willfully failed to tackle this issue?
I think that's an important question for those individuals who are identified by the Commissioner. What I can say is there's one public servant who's named in the report that I would like to specifically identify, who I worked with for a number of years on this file, Doug Scott. Doug was singled out by the Commissioner he was new to the public service. He was overly cooperative with the BC Lottery Corporation, according to the Commissioner, and should have been more aggressive with them. I would like to put on the record, having worked with Doug, that he was the architect of our government's response to the issue of money laundering in the casinos in terms of implementing Dr. German's recommendations. I find him to be a public servant of the highest integrity, and I'm very grateful for his response. I also want to recognize that my initial briefing from the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch that showed me the videos of what was happening in BC casinos, videos that I shared with British Columbians, was led by a number of Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch staff that had key roles during this period. So I think it's a complicated issue around the public service. But I will say, one of the questions we did ask the Commissioner is, how did we get here? How did we get to a stage where, as a new minister, I was sat down by the regulator and told we had a large-scale international money laundering problem in our casinos, and that had been going on for a decade. And that accountability is important. The Commissioner has made important findings about that. I think the politicians in particular, who have been identified as having key roles at the time, I hope they have some explanations for British Columbians. But the key piece of the report for me is the roadmap that's been set out about how we move forward and how we're going to be able to address this.
Yeah. I guess I got one more question. I get, corruption, the definition of corruption, it seems as though we need to prove that there was, a handing off of bags of cash, but what is your definition of corruption? And the bonuses that the bureaucrats got, the political donations, the coffers that were padded through all this gambling, does that constitute a sort of motive of corruption?
In my opinion, the government of British Columbia should not knowingly be accepting the proceeds of crime as revenue in a way that supports that criminal activity. And that is something that happened for a decade, that was insufficiently addressed, and those who are responsible for the decisions that led us to that point should definitely, in my opinion, explain how we got there. In terms of the definition of their own personal gain as being the measure of whether or not they did their jobs, I'll leave that to them to decide and British Columbians to decide. But I know for myself, I wouldn't be satisfied with the Commissioner saying, well, at least he wasn't corrupt. I hold myself to a higher standard, and I hope all politicians do.
Next, we go to the phone lines. First up, we'll hear from Richard Zussman, Global News. Richard, please go ahead.
Minister, just to that point you were making there, it is your opinion, many of the things that you have done over the last few years, before you were a minister, even while you were a minister, starts to point towards your belief that this previous government was corrupt. And Commissioner Cullen writes, to the extent that some have hypothesized that money laundering in casinos was facilitated by corrupt politicians or officials, they are engaging in conjecture that is not rooted in evidence. Are you not just engaging in conjecture even through your last answer to Graham's question?
I'm not sure what I said there, Richard, that would lead you to that place. My opinion is, when I was presented with the exact same information that my predecessor had, I approached it very differently. I had the support of the Premier and the Minister of Finance to implement Dr. German's key recommendation, which was to refuse to accept bulk cash and drafts that were unsourced. And I am grateful for the Commissioner's finding that ended a problem that had been in BC casinos for the better part of a decade. And I would encourage, I am encouraged by that finding, and I am proud of that finding. And I simply raised the question about whether for the people who held my office before me as the minister responsible for gaming can say the same.
Richard, do you have a follow-up?
One of the big issues, even with announcing this inquiry, was around accountability. I know there were concerns from yourself and the Premier about, what the goals are here. Do you believe, after 3+ years, that the right people have been held accountable, or do you believe it largely will be the public's interpretation of this that will lead to the accountability piece?
No, I don't believe the right people have been held accountable. I believe the Commissioner's finding that money laundering is an enormous problem in our province. The reason, in large part, for calling the inquiry was the collapse of a federal prosecution that, in my opinion, was a critically important case about a money service business in our province that was alleged to have laundered hundreds of millions of dollars. Because that case didn't go ahead, because we still have a almost complete gap in terms of enforcement around money laundering, the people who are money laundering are not being held accountable. And this inquiry is about how we solve that problem. In terms of political accountability, many of the people who previously held the offices that I held are no longer in government. And that is a form of accountability. And in terms of my role as Attorney General, given broad public concern about issues of corruption, it is important to confirm that there is not corruption within either the public service or government. And so these are important questions to ask.
Our next question from the phones comes from Justine Hunter, Globe and Mail.
Hi, thanks. Minister, you said it's impossible to read this report without reaching the conclusion that the federal support was not there in British Columbia. I'm wondering if you could just articulate what you think the main reasons for that is.
Well, I remember having a conversation with a senior federal official about the trade-based money laundering initiative, that this was a big focus of the federal governments, and that although the public was concerned about retail-level money laundering at casinos, that trade-based money laundering was a much bigger issue, and that's why they were going after it. So to read in this report that the working group on trade-based money laundering has essentially collapsed due to reasons that are inexplicable to me. Apparently the key person is no longer with the RCMP, was the explanation that was provided to the Commissioner, is an indication that this is not receiving priority attention from the federal government. And there's a new minister on the file. I think there's a chance to restart this relationship. I think that the report, frankly, is an indictment of failures around the federal anti-money laundering regime, and a call for reform, even within this provincial look that didn't have the authority to even receive, as you'll note when you read it, fully unredacted FinTrack reports. I hope that this report is a reset for us with the federal government, that we're able to recommence this fight, because the province will do everything we can, including taking areas of responsibility that are clearly the federal government's, to get this done. But we can do a much better job if we work together.
Justine, do you have a follow-up?
I do, thanks. I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain how would BC assume responsibility for something that is currently federal jurisdiction? So a BC police unit dedicated to this. Is there a model for that anywhere else in BC or elsewhere in Canada? And what does it look like?
So constitutionally, we can have overlapping provincial licensing and regulatory authorities in a number of areas, and one of them that I'll point to in the report that the Commissioner identified for us is in relation to money service businesses. Although this is an area where the feds do have a licensing program, the Commissioner found it's not working to the point that money service business under active criminal investigation was granted one of these licenses. The province can impose its own licensing and oversight regime on these businesses. And the Commission's report finds a number of areas like this where we can overlap and complement federal regulatory systems that are not working for our province.
Our next question comes from Rob Shaw, Check News.
Hi, Minister. You did sort of cut off for us in the beginning, so you may have already addressed this, but are you committing to accepting all of the 101 recommendations that apply to the province and implementing them all as written by the Commissioner? And if so, how long do you think that's going to take?
So I'm really enthusiastic about the Commissioner's recommendations. I think there are some that can make a significant difference in our fight against criminality and money laundering in our province. And I'm very enthusiastic about his willingness to explore ways that the province can extend our reach into areas where the current federal system is letting us down. And so I'll be working with my colleagues on implementation with the Peter German report. We are almost entirely implemented all of the recommendations that Dr. German made to us. A number of times we had to go back to Dr. German, clarify his intent and explain some departures from those recommendations and get his support for that. I anticipate that there will be similar issues with the Commission's recommendations as we get into implementation. But at this stage, government is committed to taking the recommendations from the Commissioner and implementing them.
Sure. On the BC Lottery Corporation, there is kind of an scathing repeated reference to it and the way that it advised ministers in the past that there was really nothing wrong here, and contradicting GPEB and other experts who were saying, actually, there are concerns. And I wondered, the BC Lottery Corporation as it exists today, has it been held structure and leadership and executive team and officials that are still in place there? And are you planning on doing anything about the Lottery Corporation in the wake of some kind of disturbing, findings against it?
There has been a complete turnover of the executive team and the board at the BC Lottery Corporation from the time studied by the Commissioner, the pre-2017 period.
Next question from the phones comes from Andrew McLeod, the Tyee. Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, David. Just specifically on some of those recommendations, I know you said you're enthusiastic about them, but one of them was for an independent officer of the legislature as an anti-money laundering commissioner. Is that going to happen, and when?
So the timing on any recommendations and implementation is difficult to say on week one of having this report in hand. There's a lot of policy work to do. But what I can say is that I'm certainly enthusiastic about these recommendations. I understand why the Commissioner has made that recommendation. The issue of money laundering is an ongoing one that can fade from public consciousness, and when attention wanes, as the Commissioner has found, the activity can really accelerate in a hurry. And so he wants sustained attention on that. So I look forward to working with my colleagues and with the Commissioner on implementation to achieve those goals.
Andrew, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, sure. You said you'd been moving on the Peter German recommendations already. If I'm remembering correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, he had recommended creating a new Crown Corporation to regulate casinos. Is that coming?
In the 2018 gaming control regulation changes, we implemented a number of Dr. German's recommendations, and in fact some that are in Commissioner Cullen's report today, around, for example, the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch's ability to direct BC Lottery Corporation to take certain steps. We still have some additional steps that require further legislation in terms of implementing Dr. German's recommendations, and that policy work is ongoing, and we will deliver those recommendations as well.
A couple of more questions to go on the phone. The penultimate question, Bob Mackin, Breaker News. Bob, please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. The inspiration for this commission was the Charbonneau Commission. You hosted a speech by Sonia LaBelle, the Charbonneau Commission Council, back in 2017. The Charbonneau Commission lasted for 4 years. The Cullen Commission lasted only 3 years. It did not have testimony from municipal politicians or staff or real estate developers. Why did you not let the commission continue for another year? I mean, cost can't be an issue because the Premier found $1 billion for the museum. So why didn't you let this commission go for another year to make it 4 years?
I had some very specific questions, as government did, as British Columbians did, that we wanted the commission to answer. The commission operated independent of government and received extensions of time as well as extensions of budget to deliver. I think they were challenged by COVID and impacts of COVID that caused some of the extensions, but others related to simply the volume of material that they received and the delay in receiving some material from various actors. The commissioner took the time that he needed without pressure from government to deliver this, and I'm glad he did so. The commission deliberately was set up as independent from me and independent from government in terms of doing this work. And I heard the commissioner during the commissioner's remarks, as well as his council, talking about their prioritization, where they focused on areas of risk, and those decisions were all made independent of government.
Follow up, Bob?
Yeah, both Commissioner Cullen and you made special note of the important role of the media in shining a light on money laundering. That's a nice sentiment, and we all feel good to hear those words, but your words don't really match your actions. It's right here in Hansard, November 25th of 2021, you voted for Bill 22, which watered down the Freedom of Information law and allowed the NDP to charge a $10 tax on FOI requests. Will you consider excusing reporters from paying the $10 FOI application fee?
There are some really specific recommendations from the Commissioner around public access to various databases that assist in uncovering and identifying money laundering. Those recommendations will be looked at by government. In terms of the specific FOI issue, my colleague Lisa Baer has presented extensive information about why government took those steps, including the remarkable escalation in cost to the public of processing FOI requests. And that is not canvassed by the Commissioner or the Commissioner's recommendations.
Our last question today comes from Mary Brooke, Island Social Trends.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions today. So you've mentioned that you would hold politicians to a higher standard than what was evidently happening before. Will you be approaching the former politicians for their comments or waiting for them to come forward?
So I hold myself to a higher standard than being awarded the sash of not corrupt. I'm proud of my actions that I took on this file. I am glad for the Commission's findings about the impact that those actions have had on the issue in our casinos. And I recognize and commit to prioritizing acting on the Commissioner's recommendations, how we move forward to deal with what he describes as an enormous problem. It is not going to be my job to pursue these individuals, many of whom are no longer in politics, to get their explanation, but for their own legacies, they may choose to explain why they did what they did.
Follow up, Mary?
Yeah, so the BC Lottery Corporation essentially stood by and permitted what was seen to be suspicious or obvious behavior. And as was stated by the Commissioner, there seemed to be a counter-narrative even in internal communications as to what was really going on. So you've just said today that the former executive and board has moved on, but will there be any changes asked of BCLC now as a result of this report?
There have been significant internal process changes at the BC Lottery Corporation, as well as personnel changes to respond to this issue, and I have great confidence, as it appears does the Commissioner, that BCLC is in a better place today.
Thank you, everyone, for today. That concludes today's availability.